began this series because, as I've stated, I am a long-term, die-hard, no questions asked fan of Abbott and Costello. I am a pure-blood Abbott and Costello fan. And, being a fan of anything, especially these days, is tricky. Especially in this day and age of online communities and things of that nature, fandom as a whole can get very, very toxic very, very quickly. And it seems like fandoms are separated out into various subgenres and subcultures and things of that nature. You get like the sycophantic fans. These are the people that no matter what their particular fandom does, they think it's perfect and wonderful and won't hear a word against it. I'm not trying to name names, but you see this with some Disney fans. No matter what Disney does, they're there for it. And fine, if that's your thing, then no judgment. I'm just using it as an example. Other side, you get some fandoms that get so gatekeepery and are so stuck in the mud that anything that even remotely changes their beloved formula or does things the way they don't think it should be done has destroyed the franchise and has to be bitched about for the next 50 years. I mean, again, probably the best example of this I can give is Star Wars fandom, which is just, it's 20-some years later, and we're still bitching about the Phantom Menace. And, anything they tried to do different with those Disney sequels, they just shot down and bitched and moaned about till it was, you lost all interest. So I find that being a fan, especially when you have given yourself the task of being in a critical situation of your fandom, it is a tightrope walk. I feel you've got to try to find the right balance between being a true fan and loving the work, but also being able to recognize and accurately explain when the thing that you are a fan of falls short. And especially, when it's a long-running series. Because anything that's running for any period of time and has a large number of entries into its own franchise, there's gonna be some duds in there. It's just inevitable. Just recently I had to say that a James Bond movie was the worst movie I'd seen all year, and that gave me no joy to say. But I feel like you've got to try to find that balance between being sycophantic and gatekeeper. You've got to be able to find good, constructive criticism to explain why every now and then a fandom, a thing that you love, just doesn't quite measure up. And I'm giving all of this, and I'm saying all this up front because I have to say, for the first time since I started doing this show almost a year ago, that I've seen an Abbott and Costello movie that just doesn't work. I think that of all the ones I've watched, and there's still more to come, I think this is the weakest one I have seen so far. Not the weakest one total, that one's coming, but it's definitely the weakest one I have seen so far. I am hard-pressed when viewing this film and then having to think about it later on to organize my thoughts for this review. I'm hard-pressed to come up with a moment that works, a joke that lands, anything that I could consider redeemable about this film. At their worst, all the films I've watched so far, even the ones that weren't as strong, still had something redeemable about them. The Ride 'em Cowboys, the Lost in a Harems, the Keep 'em Flyings. They may not have been the best, but there was something good in them. There was a great comic bit. There was a really funny joke. There was an energetic co-star. There was a fun premise. And in this one, it feels like there is just none of that. And again, that gives me no joy to say. But I have to be honest, and I have to judge the film in the same way I've judged all the others, and say that this time out, Coming Round the Mountain is not Bud and Lou's finest hour. It is a very weak film. So what we need to try to do here with this discussion is try to figure out why. What went wrong here? Why does this one just not work? So that's the thesis statement. That's what we're going to try to do. So before we get to that, let's talk about this movie. So what goes on in this bizarre little picture? Well, excuse me. Well, in this picture, Bud and Lou are nightclub performers. Bud is an agent. He represents both Lou and this lady named Dorothy McCoy, played by Dorothy Shea, real stretch there, who is billed as the Park Avenue Hillbilly. And that's what Dorothy Shea was billed as in real life for her nightclub act. And she's known by something similar here, and I cannot remember what it was, but it's the something, high-class hillbilly, But anyway, she's a big hit singing. Lou is, of course, messing everything up, and through comic hijinks, Dorothy discovers that Lou is actually her kinfolk, that Lou is the grandson of a great leader of the McCoy Mountain clan of Kentucky, known as Squeezebox McCoy. And that there is a treasure that the granny of the McCoy clan will reveal to the descendant of Squeezebox McCoy. So, of course, smelling money, Bud persuades Lou to go, so the three of them set off back to Kentucky to rejoin the McCoy clan, and, of course, they get into a feud with the neighboring clan, the Wakefields, and there is many a comic hijink. Yeah. I guess I should mention the other subplot going on here is that, so Lou is in love with Dorothy, but Dorothy is not in love with Lou. She is in love with some country singer who turns out to be the son of the Wakefield, so there's a Romeo and Juliet thing going on in there. But Lou is in love with her, so he goes to the Witch of the Mountains, like you do. He gets a love potion, he gives it to Dorothy, she falls in love with him. He, however, accidentally takes it himself, and he falls in love with this other mountain girl by the name of Matt, who's been following him around the entire picture, and he falls in love with her and wants to marry her. She gets a hold of the potion and drinks it, and she falls in love with Bud. So there's kind of a weird Romeo and Juliet meets Midsummer Night's Dream thing going on in here, which, I would have loved to have seen Abbott and Costello do pure Shakespeare. That would have been awesome, but that's not what this is. It's kind of ridiculous. There's numerous problems with this in terms of the Lou-Matt love story, in that the character is supposed to only be 14 years old, and Lou at this point is in his 50s, so that's a little creepy. Again, that was meant as a joke because it's one of the stereotypes of mountain folk that they marry young and marry their cousins, but it was one of those kind of things you're watching going, ha 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 ha, ooh, oh, not good, ooh. So yeah. So that's what else is going on in this. There's a treasure, there's a feud, there's mistaken love. There's just a lot happening in this, and none of it really leading anywhere. So this film has its problems. So let's dissect this, and let's take a look at this and see if we can articulate what went wrong here. And I think the first thing that went wrong here is this movie feels like it belongs in a bygone era. Now, as I've mentioned multiple times, I've watched all the Abbott and Costello films repeatedly, including this one. But this is the first time I've ever watched them in chronological order and tried to understand the history of what was going on backstage as they were being made. And as we have laid out, there is a specific formula to the Abbott and Costello films in the early days of their career versus the middle section of their career versus the later part of their career. And more so than just a formula, there's an evolution. And this film feels like it belongs back in the early days of their career because it is following that formula, a formula that no longer works to a T. So as I've mentioned, there's a very convoluted plot. And the reason there's a very convoluted plot is because there's really no plot. This is going back to the early days of Abbott and Costello films when you were just trying to get them from one humorous situation to the next and just needed some connective tissue in order to hold the whole thing together. So that's why, this treasure hunt and mountain feuds and Romeo and Juliet and Midsummer Night's Dream and witches, it's just stuff happening. Once again, we have studio mandated musical numbers. We haven't had that in a real long time. I'm trying to remember the last film they did that had this many damn musical numbers in it. But yeah, this movie starts out with like a 3-minute song, and not even a good song. It's just piddling and lackadaisical, just all over the place. It's like this goes on for almost 3 minutes before any dialogue is spoken. And I think we have to go to the other major issue here, and I'm sorry if this sounds like I'm being mean-spirited. I don't mean to, but we got to talk about Dorothy Shay playing Dorothy McCoy. I firmly believe that this picture was made not to be an Abbott and Costello picture. This was made to get Dorothy Shay over. I truly believe that. It explains everything that kind of went wrong with this picture, in my opinion. The studio-mandated musical numbers, the hillbilly mountain rustic setting. Now, there's another explanation for that America had a bizarre fascination with the Ozarks and mountain and country culture back then, or the stereotypical view of it, the hillbillies and whatnot, made very popular by the publication of the Hatfield-McCoy feud. And at Universal, the Egg and I had been a huge hit for them in 1947. That led to the very popular Ma and Pa Kettle films. And Universal had figured, well, hey, we had great success teaming Abbott and Costello up with the Monsters, and I believe there was a plan briefly for this to be an Abbott and Costello meet Ma and Pa Kettle thing to kind of cross over those two franchises. That didn't happen, I think, because they were actually filming a Ma and Pa Kettle movie at the same time as this one, so the scheduling didn't work out, so they just kind of tried to ape the style. But given that the name of our star that they're really trying to push is the Park Avenue Hillbilly, giving it that, that mountain location really serves her more than it serves Abbott and Costello. So we see the return of the pointless boy-girl story that dominates most of the plot. And again, I'm not trying to be mean-spirited here, but in the long list of Abbott and Costello leading ladies, Dorothy Shay is really, really far at the bottom. She is just not very good. And I hate to say that, history kind of proves me out on that one, because this film career that I'm sure Universal was really gunning for never really materialized for her. She has a very short filmography, and a lot of it is like one-off appearances on TV shows. And again, she was probably a very lovely woman. Nothing against her. Just saying, it was very clear this was meant to be a coming out party for her, and that they were very clearly using the Abbott and Costello name to further that agenda. Just like, in wrestling, you want to put the new the new kid over, you put him in there with the veteran and let the veteran make him look good. And that's what they were hoping would happen here. And unfortunately, it didn't. Not everybody gels and not everybody works well together. And from what I understand, there was some resentment from Bud and Lou especially on this, once again feeling they were getting shunted aside for a musical act, which, they had to do in their early career, but they were past that now. And I think that leads to the other big problem with this film, and that is that it just doesn't feel like anybody wants to be there. This film has no energy. And it's Bud and Lou looking very unenthusiastic about the entire situation. And now that could be because of all the reasons I've just listed. It could be because, by this point they've been making movies for over a decade and maybe they were tired. That's definitely a possibility. I mean, how many of these can you make one right after the other before it starts to wear on you? So it could be from outside influences, stuff going on, outside the film. But whatever the reason, this is just one of their limpest films. It doesn't seem like they're really that committed to it. And the direction seems lazy, and just everything just feels like everybody would rather be anywhere else than making this movie. And ironically, as an audience member, you'd rather be anywhere else than watching it. Couple of interesting points to make about this before we kind of wrap it up, because I don't like beating a dead horse. So as I mentioned, Dorothy Shay, not the best co-star there, but we do have some Abbott and Costello regulars returning. Joe Sawyer plays the leader of the McCoy Mountain Clan. Of course, Joe played several heavies in Abbott and Costello films. He was a henchman in both Hit the Ice and the Naughty 90s. And probably the most interesting part of this is the Frankenstein monster himself, Glenn Strange, returns to play the leader of the Wakefield clan, who likes to pronounce Wilbur, which is kind of the only mildly amusing thing in this film, is the way he's pronouncing his name. So good to see some Bud and Lou veterans back in here, but that's kind of the only interesting thing about this film. As I said, it feels like it was more designed to further Dorothy Shay's career than it was theirs, and I don't think it worked out for anybody. So yeah, I hate to say it, but Coming Round the Mountain is definitely the weakest Abbott and Costello film we've seen so far on this show. However, when we return, we are going to get a little bit of a shot in the arm, because we're going from a movie that Bud and Lou kind of made just as part of their regular contract to one that they wanted to make. And this is a film that may not be the best of their outings, but it definitely has a lot of heart, and there's a lot of good intentions behind it. And it's a film that I enjoyed very much as a younger man, and I look forward to revisiting now with an older set of eyes, because when we return, Abbott and Costello will take on the classics, because Bud and Lou will take up familiar roles in the great fairy tale Jack and the Beanstalk. So thank you very much for joining me, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.